Hello, my name's Julian Savulescu. I'm the Chen Su Lun Centennial Chair of Medical Ethics and Director of Centre of Biomedical Ethics. Welcome to this evening's presentation by Dr. Edmond Awad. Edmond is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford and a Senior Lecturer in the Department of Economics and the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at the University of Exeter. Tonight he's going to talk about public perceptions of polygenic screening of embryos, which in itself is a fascinating topic and one dear to my own heart. But the major point of the talk is really to demonstrate a novel platform that Edmond has pioneered in terms of doing research into public values. So the topic of polygenic screening is one we've given him because that's something we're interested in, but he's most famous, as he'll talk about now, for his work on programming of autonomous vehicles.
Thank you, Julian, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Young Luling School of Medicine, the Dean Yap Singh, and to Julian for inviting me here today to give this talk. And thank you all for coming here to attend this talk. And I hope you find it interesting and inspiring. Now, today's presentation is about this project, which involves a big team from several universities, funded by Wellcome, with Julian. Several members here of the team are here, including Julian, Brian, Owen, and Peng. But before I'm going to tell you about this project, I'm going to tell you a bit of a story. In 2016, we launched a website. It was called. This is our team at MIT. Back then, we launched this website. It was called Moral Machine. Basically, presented several moral dilemmas that could be faced by driverless cars. And it asked people what they think the car should do in those moral dilemma situations. So they are, of course, hypothetical. And the case is that the brake fails, and the car is going to either kill this group of pedestrians in front of it, or it will have to swerve in order to avoid that. But that means it will sacrifice its own passenger. And of course, we did this as a large-scale experiment that varied many different factors, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. But for participants, they would see different scenarios. And then after the end of 10 scenarios, they would see a results page that summarized their answers, and that was kind of gamification part of it. So when we deployed this website, we were really very excited to see, I was hoping that maybe like a couple of hundreds people might come, and maybe a couple of thousands, and we can collect some interesting data to study this. Now, 30 minutes later, the website crashed. And it crashed because we had a lot of, it was a great problem to have. We had a lot of interest, much more than we had ever anticipated for this website. So from the moment we deployed this website, it got covered in major news outlets, the New York Times, Associated Press, MIT Tech Reviews wrote about it. And then also YouTubers, apparently some gamers, were basically videoed themselves playing the game. This is PewDiePie, who at the time had the highest number of subscribers on YouTube, and brought us a lot of participants. Also on Reddit, the website made it several times to the front page, which is apparently something important because it means it has been creating some traffic. Also, it was exhibited in museums. This is from the Science Museum in London and the MIT Museum. And it was also included in several curricula in schools. This is one in the French program where they've included also the Moral Machine, as you can see with their own animation of it. And in a way, the project has captured people's imagination. Everyone felt like they have something to say about this. Everyone felt that they need to weigh in about this. And this also includes Obama, who was president of the US at the time as well. Now, after all of this attention, after 18 months, within the first 18 months, we had about 4 million users who contributed about 40 million decisions to these dilemmas. And users came from 233 countries and territories and dependencies, which shows up here on this map showing the distribution. And just for comparison, these are the map of where there is light at night, showing you like where there is like electricity or light in these areas. And you can see a good coverage of these areas. Now, this data was we collected very interesting data. And I will tell you later about the paper that we published in Nature out of this data. And it was really something we were very curious and interested in. But what was really also more interesting for us is this, how much the website has really, elicited people's engagement. Like a lot of people felt like they have to, weigh on this, have to say something about it. And it was also a great example of a case where new technology brings in with it new ethical questions. The idea in that time is that machines now are making moral decisions that autonomously, and some of those decisions actually could impact us. Like what's more than it, the machine is deciding who's to kill from us, right? But of course, the idea of machines or the idea of technologies, new technologies bringing new ethical questions is not a new idea. And it's not limited to AI technologies. So in fact, just yesterday, we deployed another website in a completely different domain. It's called TinkerTots. And the website presents ethical trade-offs about the selection of embryos based on probabilities of different attributes that they may have. Now, here's how this website goes. Basically, you imagine that you're undergoing IVF to have a child, and usually in this process, they would create several embryos, and you would need to choose 1 to 2 or 3 embryos. But now many clinics and companies actually do genetic testing or polygenic testing of those embryos and present you saying, well, these embryos have above average chance of this or that. And initially, this started with medical conditions, but now some of them started offering things like that are not medical, things like the height or educational attainment. And basically, the idea of the website is really trying to capture these kind of dilemmas in this animatic or gamified way. I'm going to tell you also a little more about the website in a second. Of course, the website was launched yesterday. We're still hoping it will crash anytime. It hasn't. Now, coincidentally, New York Times happened to be publishing 3-part piece about this same subject. In fact, they published already 2 parts, and they didn't include our website in it, sadly. I mean, they did interview Julian. But I think the timing itself should be telling that at least this is a problem that people are now getting more and more aware of and more interested in. Now, just to give you like basically the issue that this is why this is being discussed and why this is really an ethical issue. So these technologies, the IVF and let's say the pre-implantation genetic testing, on one side they do have positive side, right? So on one side they allow parents to have more control over health and some characteristics of the children, allow them to have control over that, which is good. But on the other hand, this advent of these different non-medical traits is creating like sort of some ethically challenging situations. So like, things like, I don't know, intelligence or pro-social behavior are these things that we should be selecting for or not. Yes, so now one person might say, okay, well, all right, we have these ethical problems, but you know what, like the solution is simple, like just, create a good policy to govern these things and, and then that's it, solved. But of course, in these kind of situations where the problems are complex and ethically challenging, you need also the public perception. You need to understand what also people think about this, because there is a risk of huge public reaction to the policy that are being created. And we have made this point in the past. Julian made this point as well in the past. And And other people have made the same point, saying that we need to understand what the public think about these situations. In fact, they also collected a small amount of data themselves, and they focused on, so this is what they did. They presented their participants with 3 types of services, and they said, imagine that this service will actually increase the chances of your children to be in the top 100 college. And the 3 services were gene editing, pre-implantation genetic testing, and SAT preparation. You involve them in more preparation for a SAT, which is like a test that is important for acceptance in universities. And they asked them about moral acceptability and how they're willing to use. What basically they showed is that that polygenic screening of embryos sits somewhere in between. It's not as controversial as gene editing, but it's also not like really just putting your kids, giving them extra preparation for SATs. And they showed that the same thing for willingness to use or also for morality. Now, other studies like this one have tried to they moved into like a more comprehensive list of conditions and traits, and they asked people how much would you approve of testing, polygenic testing of these conditions or of these traits. And as you can see here, the blue colors here means approval. You will see that on the left column has more approval than the right column. So showing that people generally, for most of these, basically for all medical conditions, people are more approving of doing polygenic testing for embryos than any of the ones on the right, which are non-medical traits. Now this is great. In fact, I know that Julian and Owen have also replicated these results with Singaporean participants. Now this brings us to our presentation here. So we started from the same place where these papers are by asking people, what do you think about doing testing for these embryos? But then we moved into something deeper and we think is more interesting. So I'm going to walk you through now 3 pilot studies we did, and then I'm going to move to talk about further about the website that I told you about. In this kind of presentation, I should give some kind of a trigger warning to say that this presentation would have some, it's not PG-13, but it still have some issues that could be, let's say, controversial and so could be stressing for some audience. So let's start with our first study. This is our first pilot. Again, as I said, we wanted to ask people, okay, what do you think? Would you do this? But we thought maybe it matters that if they were already doing IVF, which is a case sometimes that people would be going for IVF for the sake of IVF, or if they were not going for IVF, but now they have this opportunity of maybe doing those polygenic testing, or if they're doing a non-invasive version of testing which does not involve IVF. And in all of those cases, we asked them 3 questions. We asked them about the morality of doing it, the legality, and about their own decisions, whether they would be likely to doing it. And we basically created a set of traits and conditions. These are conditions. Some of them are physical, some are cognitive. Traits, some are physical, and some are behavioral or cognitive. Okay, so we have these 12, or 6 and 6. And in this presentation, I'm just going to only mention one of the 3 questions here because the other 2 were kind of similar, same trends. Would you undertake testing? Yes, no, not sure. And basically, what we found is that this manipulation of already, should, or no does not make much of a difference. It does, but it's very small. But what kind of really interesting here is, in a way, we see that the top 3 that people approve of are all medical conditions. Actually, the top 6 as well, you might say, well, there is some kind of overlap, but still, this kind of replicates the previous results. And the previous 2 studies that I told you about is that people find it acceptable for medical conditions, not so much for non-medical traits. Now, in that same study, we decided for exploration purposes, said like, you know what, we want to try to see what if we actually give them and say like, here is an embryo, And here are the chances. It has a higher chances of having these traits or these conditions. Would you keep it or would you discard it? And we realized this was, a tough kind of question to deal with. Now, when we did that, we found that the top 6 or 7, they were all traits. But this is not really surprising, because so the top are the traits and the below are the conditions. This is not surprising because we were telling people higher chances of these traits. And we were basically framing those traits in a positive way. So we were saying IQ, saying above a higher chance of high IQ, and high creativity, pro-social, musical talent. So obviously people would be more likely to keep than discard. But what was really interesting is that they actually cared at all, right? Like, if you did not want to test for those traits, then why does knowing about those traits making any importance or making any difference to you? So, of course, we realized that this was not properly done to capture what we're trying to capture because it was just an exploration. So this is where we decided to move to the next study where we tried now to do this more properly. And now, instead of just saying higher chances, we said higher than average chances, because that's an important distinction. But we also included cases of average chances and below average chances. And we used almost the same 12 attributes. We just replaced one of them, which was well-being. It was kind of vague, and it was the only positive, or like, let's say, desirably framed medical conditions. So now in this way, we know that we have 6 conditions in this case that they are sort of not desirable, and the 6 traits that are sort of desirable. And for the purpose of this now, you would realize we are doing this on Prolific. So this is data that we're paying for. You can already see that we have so many different combinations of things. So we have to do some sampling. And this is where discrete choice experiments come handy. So basically, we created some sort of a trade-offs now. So we're no longer asking about one specific conditions or traits, because obviously if you tell people, like, okay, would you keep this embryo, would you not keep this embryo, it has this one feature, then people would be only focusing on that one feature. But now if you include 2 features, this creates some sort of a dilemma. We also included sex because we thought it might show some interesting stuff for people. So basically, you see here you have an embryo on the left, and it says, for example, it's a female. And for each participant, we sampled 2 different attributes. So in this case, it was 1 condition and 1 trait. And the embryo 1 has average chances of both. Embryo B has significantly below average chances of both, and it's male. And then we ask people, which one would you implant? And we do this about 15 times, each time varying those chances, right? But we're keeping these 2 separate. Another participants would see 2 different attributes, and they will also be facing similar kind of trade-offs. Now, after we collect this data, what we want to really understand is how much people use this information in making their decisions. So here's how we do it. First of all, let's say we take, for any attributes or any conditions, we take the scenarios where it had an average chances. We take all those scenarios, and we calculate how often people chose to implant the embryo that have that chances. And then we do the same thing for the cases where it has above average chances. And we also calculate probability of implanting conditional on being above average chances. And then we subtract these 2 probabilities. And this is called delta P. Now this difference between these 2 has another meaning. It could be understood as if you took an embryo with average chances and you replace it with another one with above average chances, how much does the probability of your implantation change, right? So it's change in percentage point. So here are the results of what we found. The numbers in blue here, as you can see, these are the comparisons between the above average chances and the average chances. Now, because these conditions are all undesirable conditions, as you can see, the change in probability shifts negative, right? This is just saying that people prefer an embryo with average chances of heart disease than above average chances of heart disease. Now notice how, on the other hand, which is the below average chances, even though it is chosen more, somehow it is not as, the difference is not as big. So people are more sensitive to the information about the less desirable or more negative aspect of the desirable. With rate, we see also similar things, but now the below average chances are the thing that is not desirable because the traits themselves are desirable. So in a way, if you say, well, you have average chances of pro-social behavior or below average chances of pro-social behavior, then probability goes down by this much. And the same thing here. Now, interestingly here, I wanted to point about, first of all, this idea of this asymmetry, how it does not depend on whether it's above or below, it depends on whether it is desirable or not. But also, I wanted to look at IQ and the pro-social behavior. These are the ones that people have used that information. So this is kind of, in a way, now re-highlighting the same findings we found before, but now in a more proper way, is that people do actually use this information about the traits, even though, as we said, they did not want to test for them. So we wanted to test this again and try to replicate it, but now with also different other factors. So one thing we did is, let's try to increase the sensitivity of those chance levels. So now we have 7 levels. We have significantly, moderately, slightly. And because we're expanding in this way, we're going to also focus on few attributes now. And in this case, we decided to keep 3 attributes, which are the heart disease, vision impairment, and high IQ, but we changed pro-social behavior to antisocial behavior, which is not the direct opposite of pro-social behavior, but we thought that would be more important for people. And in the same way, we created those dilemmas. Again, now we have only 4 possible combinations that will be allocated to. Again, this is a second example. In this study, we did try another thing, is that we thought maybe if we tell people what does significantly mean, it's 10 percentage point or 25 percentage point, maybe this will make a difference. As it turns out, it did not make any difference. So from then on, we dropped that factor. Here's what we found. And in this case, the x-axis is similar interpretation to the previous figure. So here, significantly is dark red, moderately, slightly. As you can see, they nicely line up as you would expect them to, especially in the negative side of the chart. Of course, it's smaller for vision impairment. But interestingly, again, we see that how if they are more shrunk and condensed in the case of the below average chances, which is the more desirable part. Similarly, for the 2 traits, we also see, now here note that the high IQ is now the only positive attribute here, and that's why it has the reversed color from the others. But again, what is really striking now here is that if we look at the significantly above for all the 3 and significantly below for high IQ, we see that the difference in probability is about 40 percentage points. Now, this is quite interesting now. So we're not like talking about that people also just use this information, but to some degree, they use it almost to a degree close to the degree they use information from heart disease. Now, remember that these are all pilot studies, and we do have planned studies after this, but I want to also show you more evidence of what we found that this is quite striking, is that if we take only the dilemmas that have, let's say, above average chances of heart disease, but below average chances of antisocial behavior, this is like the top one, versus the dilemma where you have below and above. So in a way, you're asking people to choose, do you want an embryo that has a high chance of having heart problems, but low chance of having antisocial behavior, or an embryo that has the complete opposite, then the choice is really close to 50-50. Of course, the second one is the obvious choice where we make both of them, we have an embryo that that is better than the other on both. So that's kind of obvious. Similarly, if we do this comparison with heart disease and IQ, as well we see, of course, there is a bit more preference to the heart disease, to reducing heart disease, but it is still close to 50-50. While on the other hand, compared to vision impairment, these two features were actually preferred, or people sought to avoid them more than they try to avoid things like vision impairment. So what does this all, to summarize all of this? When you ask people if they're willing to do testing for non-medical traits, it seems like people will be like, no, we don't want to do that. That's kind of the general trend. But if you give them that information about non-medical trait being part of this embryo, they want to use it. Now, this doesn't mean that people are hypocrites, but it means that there is something here that is a psychological phenomena that is well documented. It's called deliberate ignorance. Is this the idea that sometimes, in some situations, we might actually choose to not learn more information about something? And there are so many different reasons of why people would do that. In fact, this is Ralph Herdwick, who has championed this concept. They have a book that kind of explains all of these different situations. But in our case, it is very likely that it's either that maybe people don't want to avoid this cognitive dissonance. I don't want to know if they are going to be, if this embryo is very smart or is not going to be very smart, because if I know, I will have this conflict inside of me, because maybe I think I should not do that. But it could be also because of your social signaling, that maybe when it comes to your choice, you cannot really ignore it, but if people are asking you, you end up saying, no, we wouldn't want to test for these things. So this is where we basically stopped with the pilot studies. And from then on, we wanted to test this properly because we also want to make sure that we're using the correct way of doing this. And one of the best outlets to do this is to submit a registered report to Nature Human Behavior. Of course, it could be other journal. But in this case, we basically submitted to Nature Human Behavior telling them, this is the kind of analysis we plan to show. This is what we hypothesize. This is what we expect to see. And this report now is under review. So fingers crossed for it. But now I'm going to move to talk to the website. So before I tell you about what we did with the website, I want to first tell you about what we found with the Moral Machine, because I think it would help you maybe appreciate the value of what we're going through, because it is a lot of work and it is quite costly, but we're hoping that it will be paying off. So I mentioned before the results of the Moral Machine that we published in the journal Nature, and basically what we were trying to show, we showed that in our experiments, we varied several factors. Things about whether the car should stay or swerve, whether the casualties are pedestrians or passengers, whether they were crossing legally or not, gender, age, so all of these things. And these you could think of each one of these as a different hypothesis itself. So we have 9 hypotheses, and we're varying these ones on top of each other. Now, thankfully, thanks to the sheer data that we had, we were able now to analyze basically the effect of these factors and also compare the hypotheses to each other. So the x-axis here is very similar to what I explained before. It is also a difference between probability of choosing taking all the scenarios that have humans, how often people choose to save the humans, and all the scenarios that have pets and how likely people to save pets, and then we subtract these two, and we see here that 0.6, so 60 percentage point more for saving the humans. And then you could do the same with number of lives. So if you add one more character to the scenario, this is how much people's probability increases to save the group. If you add 1, 2, 3, and 4, and on average is less than sparing humans over pets. And then you could do the same thing for others, and you can see that at the bottom we have these 3 strong factors that people have approved of the car discriminating over. So sparing humans over pets, sparing more lives over fewer lives, and then sparing younger lives over older lives. But there were also other things like sparing people who were crossing legally over those who were illegally crossing, and sparing the higher status over lower status. Now, it seems a bit the case of sparing the young over the older is quite peculiar. A lot of people will probably find it maybe acceptable that sparing humans over pets, sparing more lives over fewer lives, that might be also acceptable. But sparing the young over elderly, it sounds like where does this come from? Is this driven by some of our characters? Well, we can do the same kind of analysis on every character that we had, and we had about 20 different characters. So comparing now to the adult male and female, we can also calculate probability of sparing each character when it appears on its own compared to when we have one adult male or female. And we can see here that the top 4 characters, they're all include young characters. And even at the bottom, aside from the dog and the cat and the criminal in between, elderly man, elderly woman also comes at the bottom of the list. So it seems like this preference for younger over elder seems to be like something that people approve of for different kind of situations. Now, remember I told you that this website have reached so many different countries. So what kind of analysis we do is that we can also calculate those 9 numbers for each of those countries, and then we can calculate a distance between every pair of countries. And then we use these distances, or pairs between pairs, to do some sort of a clustering, hierarchical clustering, which allow us to see things at many different levels. Here we could see, for example, that we have 3 large clusters. The color of the branches, you have red, blue, and yellow. We call them Western, Southern, and Eastern. But also you can see for every country what is the closest country in terms of their answers. I looked at Singapore, and apparently Sri Lanka is the closest. I don't know why. What we could also do is we could see how the different clusters differ from each other. Now, these are z-scores. So for the Western cluster, which had it has a majority of countries, they are basically defining sort of the mean in this case. But interestingly, we can see that the Eastern cluster, which includes many countries from East Asia and Southeast Asia and Islamic world, have interesting preference, things like sparing the young over the elderly. Now, I want to clarify here that these are z-scores. So in most situations, let's say, when it comes to sparing the young over the elderly, most countries said we want to spare the young over the elderly, right? But the difference, the magnitude of difference was varied, right? So it was less pronounced for this Eastern cluster, which kind of also confirms previous anthropology and cultural studies that says that societies in these areas have a higher respect for the elderly, they have a stronger family ties, and they believe that the elderly also have special knowledge and wisdom that they can only access through them. The Southern cluster, which is basically, I forgot to say here, it's this is the Southern cluster. It was kind of like had 2 subclusters, one of them Latin American countries, and then you have France and their former colonies put together in one sub-branch. And somehow, for some reason, is that France and those countries have been, in a way, more sparing of females over male lives. They have a much higher values of females over male lives. We don't know much about, from the literature, why this is the case. Other things we could do is also we could try to study what factors could predict those changes. For example, one thing that is usually studied in culture is this individualism versus collectivism. Like the societies that are individualist, people focus on the individuals. The institutions are very strong. They have a strong rule of law. But societies that are collectivist, they think about themselves as part of a group. Their loyalty is for their family, extended family members. Their family ties are stronger, but maybe their institutions are not as strong. So one thing we found here is that how individualist the country could predict how utilitarian they are. Also, another factor is rule of law, how much the law is respected in a country, which interestingly correlated with how much people were willing to punish the lawbreakers. So in a countries like maybe Germany and Japan, where the law is very well respected, people thought it was acceptable to punish the jaywalkers, while in other countries like in Latin America or in Middle East, where I'm from, people find it that it's an outrageous punishment if you have just jaywalked and the car should kill you. So anyway, this was a detour to the moral machine. We had another website, which is called My Goodness, which was also inspired by the moral machine, about charity dilemmas, and it also had about hundreds of thousands of users and millions of decisions. And these kind of models of tool, which I just talked about in both of these two projects, is kind of, we can describe it as discrete choice experiments, which is something that is usually used in marketing and in some parts of macroeconomics, but they are developed as online serious games. Now, this is, you could think about it as a one research tool among this toolbox of tools, and it has a lot of advantages. One of them is that it has a potential to scale. So compared to other ways of paying participants, we could not have been able to pay all of these participants of the moral machine. Somebody in the team actually calculated it was lots of money. And once you manage to scale, you end up being, you're able to test so many different hypotheses and compare these hypotheses to each other. You also get a better representation compared to traditional types of studies, because now usual studies end up focusing more on one country. In most cases, it's the US. In many other cases, it's another Western countries. In our case, we managed to get and reach outside the Western world. And also allow you to study heterogeneity, which means that you're not only focused now on one point value of people prefer this or that. No, you can dig deeper now and say, well, actually, it depends on the demographics of people. It depends also on the other factors in the study. So it gets you to have a richer type of analysis. And finally, they also have this other effect that they could be also pedagogical, used for pedagogical purposes, like in the case of the moral machine, where we had several people using it in classes and giving it to the students. So now we go back to the TinkerTots, where we started, sort of. So this is the website, and it's tinkertots.net. I encourage you all to go on and play a little bit with it and give us some data. This is an example of a scenario where you get sampled 2 different attributes, and it shows you here that you can have this one, which have this below average chances for one, above for the other. Now, in making this website, we considered several factors. The predicted sex, as you can see, the direction, higher chances, lower magnitude. We also, whether there are traits or conditions, whether they are physical or cognitive or behavioral. And we actually are considering a large, so this is again, remember this is like a scaling up. So now we can test for more conditions and traits than you would usually do in a regular study. So we're considering all of these different traits. Some of them, of course, the technology is not able to test in embryos. Others, maybe they cannot test today, but in the future they do. And they are like a basically, these are the conditions, totals of 35 traits or conditions. And this is just another example. So in a one session, if you go there, you see in one session, you will be given the same 2 attributes. And in 6 of the scenarios, you will be given binary choice. But then there is one choice where you have to choose 1 to 3 out of 8. And this one, I know it's overwhelming. It's a lot to say. But basically, this is trying to model the real life situations where usually people are choosing among 8 available embryos. And because this is a gamified, it has a gamified aspect to encourage people to do it, it's providing them with a summary of their choices that presents how they have answered. Now, we have also another project that we're planning to launch sometime soon. It is about nature and conservation. And of course, a lot of people talk about conservation, and they mention something called win-win situations, when you try to do things that are good for humans and also good for nature. But in truth, that what happens is sometimes the preferences or priorities of both could come in conflict, like several of these cases where you have a habitat of, let's say, like a panda, endangered species, and now you hear about news of being that, maybe the government or something, like they want to tear it down to build some other kind of building, like in this case, solid waste treatment plants. Could be a hospital, could be a mental health unit, or could be a nightclub. The species could be a tiger, could be whatever. So we're also exploring the domain of these kind of questions. And that's it for my presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So the reason why we gave you polygenic testing is because we have a large genomics grant from the Singaporean government. But I'm wondering what else you think this gamification, serious online game, creating these platforms, what other applications in medicine you could foresee?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do want to say that, like any other tool, this is not necessarily a tool to use in any research question. In some situations, it might not make sense to use it. I would say generally questions that are, especially does not have a clear right or wrong, so it's like a ethically contentious situations, situations that have maybe emotional aspect that people might connect to, have a moral dimension to it, that people feel inclined to say something about it. But also questions where it's really like, that there is somewhere that people draw the line on, and it's not clear where the line is. This is the cases where we can vary different factors that could impact people's decision. And for example, in the domain of the medical domain, one thing is this allocation of limited resources, like the intensive care units, for example, or ventilators or vaccinations. These are situations that are contentious, that could have a lot of factors you could think about, where you could change people's answers. Other situations is trade-offs of priorities. Maybe like situations where you have individuals versus the individual's priorities versus group priorities. For example, like in the case of in COVID, we've seen a lot of these kind of trade-offs. Like the quarantine, forced quarantine, for example, vaccination. So these are kind of decisions where people have to, the agency of individuals have to be limited in order for the benefit of the group. Also, some decisions that are very high stake but also irreversible, things like assisted dying, abortion. These situations, you can see that many people it might seem that many people will be like either yes or no, but when you start digging deeper, people will start realizing, oh, okay, maybe in this case I would be fine and to change my answer.
Yep, thank you. That was a fascinating presentation. The question that I had was actually in one of the slides where you were presenting the outcome of the Tinkertots data so far. It seems like one of your independent variables was well-being, but I'm not very sure if I missed it. But how did you operationalize well-being? Because it felt a bit strange to see that well-being ranked lower than some other traits.
Yeah, I do agree that it's, this is, again, one of the pilot studies. We were exploring things, and later we realized it's not a great condition to include. And it was also like the only one that was positively framed. So this is how we explained it: personal sense of happiness and life satisfaction. Yeah. Which is, again, it's vague, it's not great, and yeah, it ended up being...
Just a bit of clarification. So is the subjective well-being in the Tinkertots, or is it in your pilot study? Or is it both?
So this is in the pilot study.
Okay.
I'm not completely sure if we did include it in the...
Yeah, thanks for this. So what I was curious about is why there isn't this is a neutral option. So you have two options, and why there isn't an option to say it doesn't make a difference to me, and just like flip a coin or something.
Yeah, I mean, people did ask us this question about the moral machine. I think we just didn't want to give people an out. Because at the end of the day, yes, we realize that people will probably, there might be situations where people might be like, I'm really indifferent between those cases, right? Now, and then at the individual level, it might seem unfair that they have to, it will be recorded that I chose this side or this side. But at the statistical level, if you have a bunch of people who are undecided, they're going to end up being, on average, choosing both sides equally, right? So for us, so in this case, we didn't want to give people an out. We didn't want to throw this data out. But yeah, we could have added and made it a little bit less, intense.
Thank you for your talk. It was really great. So in moral psychology, we run surveys, as you know, testing participants all the time, where we manipulate different conditions, and they do suffer from the limitations you mentioned. They're costly. They only target US or UK. So I'm wondering whether you think what you think are the limitations of your approach, or should all of us just stop traditional experimental surveys and start making these websites?
Yeah, because because it's very expensive, and it's a high risk because after building all of this, I think this is a very important question actually to ask yourself, that can I answer this question by just running a study on prolific, right? Why would I need to go into this approach, right? So if you have a justifiable answer, so like, for example, like you want to study, across different countries, that might be, you want to study heterogeneity in other aspects, so you need more data, you have a lot of hypotheses that you think is important, and also you think that you will actually get people interested, because this is, we're not paying anyone to do this. People will have to do this just because they think it's fun or because they think it's interesting. So every project like this of course, has this risk in it, but potentially have this advantage. Now, the other maybe disadvantage is that, yes, it is more representative, but at the same time, it is limited to people who are on the internet and people who are interested in the subject specifically, right? So obviously in places where, there are many places in Africa we couldn't reach because there is no electricity. In some countries, the economic, let's say the economic inequality could actually make a difference in terms of who can access our website and not. So there are these issues as well, where if you, for example, wanted to study, let's say in Colombia or something, then you would get a better data if you do national representative sample, which is more expensive to do, but you can do it for this one specific country.
Yeah, I should say that it's taken 3 years really now, hasn't it, to develop the Last Haven website platform and the Tinkertots platform, and probably close to £100,000. But once you've done it, you can change it. So you can't just as an individual researcher take 3 years and spend up. But once you've got it, it's a platform that you can use for 10 years. And you can also, he hasn't paid participants, he's getting them to do it out of it. But we have a panel of Singaporeans here. We could pay them to actually, take part on the platform and as a representative sample. So you could actually pay people. So I think it's a kind of, it's kind of national, creating a corporation out of a research methodology. I think this idea of everyone sitting there in their own laboratory doing their own little experiment is probably gone, that you're going to have to sort of work in teams and do this sort of large-scale experimentation.
Thanks, Eddie. I was really interested in the issue of deliberate ignorance. And you said that some people might say, I wouldn't want to test for that. But then when you give them the information, now they're in a position to make a decision, they seem to take it into account. I wonder if you encounter people who make a similar point about doing this type of research, where they'll say, look, once you start asking about which of these traits might people be picking and choosing versus various tests, aren't we just sort of normalizing the sense that that's something maybe we should consider doing? And so maybe it's better for us to be deliberately ignorant about people's attitudes towards some of these technological possibilities.
Yeah, we were asked these questions about the moral machine specifically because it did create the impression that these things should matter. which didn't. I think this is, I don't know, this gets into like a philosophy of science to me. It's like, I think I can understand some people being like, well, I would like to stay not informed about this, and it's good for them, but I think there are things that you're also not supposed to study, I guess. So this is a question of what is more important. And in science, I think safety, for example, comes above truth finding, right? Because we have this IRB, all of this ethics committee that says, well, you cannot run this study because it has like a danger on safety. But there are sometimes other considerations that you have to do the trade-off. So yeah, it is a trade-off. It's not an easy decision, and some people might choose otherwise, and I would respect that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think you didn't show this slide, which I think is going to get this to Lorenz, the last question. But it's got this really excellent slide. So I did a consultancy for Mercedes-Benz. They are going to have to program their cars. And you might say, well, these scenarios are irrelevant. But he's got a slide where he's got, a truck, and then in the other lane a car, and then a bicycle. And you have to decide how close are you going to go to the truck and how close are you going to go to the bicycle. So you're going to increase the probability of hitting the truck or hitting the bicycle. So, someone's going to have to make that decision. So at least I think it's useful to know what the public's values are, and there's some consideration of them. But the point is that these decisions are unavoidable, and ignorance, once you have the power to change the outcome, brings responsibility.
Can I follow up on the willful ignorance part? So, because say in the context of say genetic testing, I could imagine that there is sort of a component or there is a similar structure to say, a drug addict knows I cannot go to the bar because if I go, I'll start drinking. So, and in a sense, you put people into the bar, and maybe they make decisions for which they really hate themselves. So, I think it would be very interesting to also study that part, like which trade-offs do people want to make, and which trade-offs, have this I'm the alcoholic in the bar feeling, and I'm gonna hate the decisions.
Are you talking about this study in general, or are you talking about the polygenic screening?
Yeah. So in general, in the context of screening, I think that would be a really interesting question to study more about. Which trade-offs do we want to make? Not so much which trade-offs are we making, but maybe there are some trade-offs that if you put me in the position, I'm going to make a decision, and later I'm going to hate myself.
Yeah, thank you for making that point, because I think this is an important implication from these findings, is that in several countries, these things, maybe in some countries they say, oh, do you want to test or not? But in some countries, they don't even consult you if you want to test or not. They say, look, we usually test for all of this. This is what we have. Like, what do you want to learn about this? I think in some countries I've heard that they don't even let you choose. They would say, look, we did the test. These are the 5 embryos that are all healthy, and you can choose from them. So they've already...
Right, sort of a delegation. It's like, you didn't do it. You don't have to help. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I think, for cases where they're saying like, look, we do tests for all of these things, so why not here? We give you you make the choice. Then that's probably should not be the case because of this, right? Because
we probably should put a question in at the end after they've done that, saying, having done this, do you think you should just leave these traits to chance?
Yeah.
Or would you want to make decisions about it? Because after doing all that, they might say, oh, no, actually, I agree, I'd rather not be faced with that. But my hypothesis is people will say.
But I think it would be also interesting to see, say, if you compare, say, you give people different subsets of choices that they can make, and then later you ask them, and then when they're done, you ask them, how happy are you with your choice? Mm-hmm. So, say, standard economics would say, the more choices you can make, the better off you are, because the more sort of fine-grained the maximization is.
Yeah.
But maybe because if you're sort of forcing people into decisions that they don't want to make, you may
It's a
pick
cost.
up this "I hate myself"
Yeah.
for being such a jerk and making these choices.
Absolutely, yes, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I appreciate that, there are important safety decisions that need to be made, but there seems to be like a collection of values that you're considering here. So of course, we're going to want to know whether, we should swerve for a truck to hit a dog or a person. Like these are, basic important questions. But your studies go beyond and they ask things like, would it be better to hit a wealthy person or a homeless person? And when you ask that question, like you suggested, you're putting value and you're suggesting that these things actually do have value. So what I want to ask is, why do we need to know that? And then to bring your studies together, might you ask, should we hit the autistic child or the neurotypical child? Why do we need to know these things? Why don't we just put it at here are the safety things we need to know and assess there?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are several reasons. One of them has a policy implication, right? So obviously, we're not going to program driverless cars in that way. But let's say some company program their cars that does not even consider any of these dilemmas. But as a side effect, they end up killing more children than adults. Now, this kind of discrimination against children would probably make people more outraged about it, right? And so these kind of companies will be forced to fix their own problems. So this is something we would know because we ask people these kind of questions.
But then that follows then, suppose that people are like, oh, we should hit the gay people, okay? And it just so happens that the company programs to hit the gay people. And it's like, well, we know what people think and it's not an outrage, so we don't need to change it because we just keep the status quo.
Yes, I didn't mean that it should be just outrage-based policy. I think it's kind of a knowledge that the policymakers will have to know, right? And they do usually policymakers do usually try to learn about what the public would react to different policies. They can choose to ignore it. They can choose to maybe communicate the policy better. They can choose to, it's helpful to know that a lot of people think, have this hatred toward gays, so that you can plan better. Like you can try to plan to how you can think about how I can avoid this, for example. Right? But if you don't know about it, it's gonna stay under, right?